Absolutely.
Hi, welcome to the Muslim Street. This is your host, Hina Lotus. We have a super exciting episode for us today. Before we get right into it, I did want to do a couple of shout outs and, express my gratitude. Of course, lots of gratitude for Lance Skur for hosting this, doing all the technology. He's in Ghana. It's in the middle of the night. So all his sacrifices mean so much to us. Also wanted to give a huge shout out to Malik Aziz, my co-host, for creating this platform, allowing Muslims from all different backgrounds to have this these uncensored conversations and discourse that we are able to have. And then I also wanted to give a shout out to Nodder, who does all of our graphics. He's also part of Radio Watermelon. They are raising funds for Gaza right now on X. So please make sure to follow him at Bonzi Sky, as well as following Radio Watermelon at Radio Watermelon on X. But that being said, I did want to introduce my guest today. We will be discussing essentially Islamophobia in the West and rescinding Islamophobic language within the context of the Ummah. This is a huge milestone for the Muslim Street because we have an all-female panel. I feel super empowered. I feel like this is going to be an amazing discussion. So, Dr. Furia, please introduce yourself. Share whatever you would like. We are super excited to get to know you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Dr. Faria. It's so nice to have everyone here. So a little bit of background about me. I am a clinical assistant professor at a college of pharmacy, and I am a founder of MEG, Muslim Equity Group. It's a nonprofit organization that works on finding equitable solutions through Muslim-driven members. And yeah, I'm really, really excited to be here. It's a really heavy topic, but I'm excited to have discourse around it. I feel like we could have lots and lots of discussions over it, but I hope we can have a fun discussion over it.
Thank you so much, Faria. And I also wanted to introduce Dr. Hira Jaff. If you can please introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about, your education, career, your background, interests. We'd be super humbled.
Hi, everyone. My name is Dr. Hera. I am a palliative care physician and just a lover of speaking about spirituality and what is meaningful in our lives, because that's also what I do with my career. So, Dr. Faria was sweet enough to invite me onto this, and I'm very, very excited to have this very important but very meaningful discussion moving forward. This is also a passion of mine, is to discuss topics that are difficult but are in need of more discussion.
Thank you so much. I'm super humbled to have both of you on. And, we have a lot to cover over the next hour or so. So I'm going to get straight into the questions. The first question that I did want to kind of get into, it's more of like a discussion point. But all of us, it seems like, have grown up in the West, and we've kind of had to balance our Western identities growing up in the West, as well as growing up Muslim. So I kind of wanted to kind of get into the um, I guess you can say, like, our childhoods, experiences, into the community that we're in, and then also like discuss the different aspects of being a Muslim in the Western world, the good, the bad, the ugly, all of it. So Dr. Furia, if you wanted to go first.
Yeah, I would love to, but I'm actually going to push it to Dr. Hira first. I'm going to, and then I'll build off of it.
Thank you so much. I feel like what's special about being raised in the West as a Muslim is if you're a very introspective person, especially since so much conversation is around mental health and our identities, we kind of have to figure it out ourselves. We have to figure out who we are within the context of being an American, about being a Muslim, and I also think being a female, for us in particular. So I think that is a big positive, actually, to have to figure out what religion means to us rather than just take it for granted that we're being raised in an environment that's inherently religious or Islamic or even cultural for us. Um, Sometimes I wonder people who are raised more in the East if they struggle with that identity or if they just take it for granted because they're just doing what everyone else around them is doing. Um, so the challenge, though, I feel is if you don't know where to turn to, if you don't have good influences around you, or you're in an environment where you don't know who you can turn to when you're lost or when you don't know how to figure that identity out. So it's a really tough balance. I can imagine a lot of people probably struggle with it.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think something that took me a while to understand is that our parents, they wanted to do their due diligence and prepare us to be, strong Muslims in the West, but we have certain challenges that they could not apprehend. And a lot of times we didn't realize we had those challenges ourselves. So there's like positives and negatives to being raised in the West while being a Muslim as well. So, for example, the positive is that we have many resources and we have access to a lot of education. And so the beauty about Islam is the deeper you dig, the more you learn, right? Like it has science in it, it covers finances, women's rights, theology, law, inheritance, all of these beautiful things. And we have a lot of that background where we can appreciate it and really understand the depth of Islam. Now, I will say the caveat to this is that while being in the West, we are victims to a lot of the Western propaganda. And I actually didn't realize that until I became a lot older. One of the things that I've noticed is that a lot of Muslims, they only know the rudimentary level of Islam. And a lot of that is learning that secondhand from our parents, right? Like we know our five pillars, and then it pretty much stops at that, and we think Islam is more of a practicing religion, and it's a way of life, and it really teaches you how to navigate everything. So for me, it was really difficult to overcome that propaganda about what Islam is without having the knowledge about exactly what Islam is. Because no one was there pushing me to dig deeper and understand the full beauty of it. And so I had to be able to dismantle all of the Western propaganda because honestly, being introspective and looking back, I realized that I was a victim of the propaganda. I had a lot of difficulty trying to let the two of them coexist. I knew that every Muslim I knew was a great person. I knew that Islam was a religion I loved, but I didn't know how to navigate that with everything I was seeing on the media. I'm seeing things about terrorism. I don't know how to have those discussions with people if those questions come up. So the only thing I knew how to do was to compartmentalize those things. So there's Islam that I know, and then there's the things that I'm seeing in the West, and I don't know how to marry those two together. And so I think the biggest message and like discourse we need to discuss today is how do you overcome those barriers? How do you overcome that propaganda? How do you allow your two identities to coexist? Because the truth is, they can coexist and they should coexist if you are learning Islam to the depth that you have the capability to learn it.
No, these are actually really good points. And I'm glad that both of you brought it up because, growing up as a Pakistani woman in the United States, I kind of felt like Islam, for me at least, when I was younger, I learned it through the cultural lens of being Pakistani. And there's a very big difference between practicing religion purely like for the sake of the religion versus through the lens of like another culture. So I think there's two cultures that were at play. There was the Western American culture, right, where Dr. Faria said there was a lot of propaganda that made you feel like, okay, if you're too religious, maybe you're susceptible to becoming, a terrorist or being a fanatic or being too judgmental. And then you have the Pakistani cultural lens where, for example, I grew up being a super strong, at that time, not anymore, a very strong Western feminist. And so when I saw misogynistic Pakistani practices of misogyny within the community and I saw Muslim people engaging in it, I thought, okay, Muslim people are doing this, thus this must be Islam. I don't know if I agree with that. And it wasn't until I got older and I realized, wait, what I saw was not a byproduct of religion. This was a byproduct of culture. And when you put religion before culture, that's when you see these issues like misogyny and racism and, subordination of like poor people and things of that nature eradicated. The reason we see these issues so prevalent in the Western and the Eastern world is because people are not practicing their religion. they have the identity of being a Muslim. They may be following the 5 pillars, but ultimately they are still engaging in very toxic, very like negative cultural practices. And the entire inception of Islam was to do away with those things. But that being said, it does bring me to my second question. I wanted to actually get into language. Language is so deeply important, especially when we talk about the media, the environments that we grew up in, the schools that we went to, our colleagues when we went to school, our families. How do you think language plays a role into how like religion is defined, specifically Islam in the West, as well as how it may feed into Islamophobia if we're using the propaganda that is fed to us through the media? I know that's a very, very big question, but please answer it as well.
Yeah.
Dr. Hira, if you wanted to go first.
I'll have Dr. Faria go first for this.
Okay, so yeah, that is a huge question, and I'm going to try to do my due diligence. But like the first thing I'll say is something that we should all realize is that Islam is perfect, but Muslims are not perfect. And there's nothing wrong with that. And I feel like if we use that lens to look at the people around us and have more grace for the people around us, then that helps us be able to navigate a lot of those conflicts we have with identity and a lot of the propaganda that we're seeing. So if I see someone who, their identity is a Muslim and they are carrying a lot of these misogynistic qualities, that doesn't necessarily have a reflection of the religion. It just means that they are human. That's what humans are. We're imperfect. We're on this journey together. So if you already have that foundation of this propaganda being fed into your mind and then a lot of those cultural conflicts, one of the things that we often overlook is what language can do for that. So our language is essentially a mirror to our public opinion. How we speak about Islam affects people's opinions on it, even Muslims. So, for instance, I come across a lot of people who don't know anything about Islam, but all they know about it is the way the media discusses it. So, they hear terms like Muslim extremists or radical Islam, and they tie that with terrorism, and that's the only thing they know about Islam. And the context and the narrative that builds in their minds, it's extremely damaging to the community's reputation. It builds into anti-Muslim bias, especially with these connotations that don't have proper cause and effect. And America is no stranger to using problematic terms. I feel a lot of American language, we've been trying to dismantle a lot of words that have an origin that is racist or it has a negative connotation. And it's our job to find those terms that are problematic for us and say, hey, this is something that we need to remove from our language, or we need to find a better term for it, because the way we speak about it is a mirror. It is going to impact us and how we feel about Muslims, or feeding into Islamophobia, even Muslims themselves using those terms.
Yeah, I agree. Dr. Hira?
Yeah, I was going to actually say that as difficult as it is, I think the language that we use, we don't inherently know that we're using, and that is because of media and because of the news and things like that. And I don't know if you guys have had this experience, but I've had multiple experiences where people will even kind of take a step back if I ask them, like, "Oh, do you consider yourself religious?" Like, even the term religious ends up having this heavy negative connotation. And I think it really does stem from this idea that religious means extreme. Religious means something that's more than it actually is, when it's should be like something beautiful, or something that, really shows somebody's soul and wanting to be closer to their dean, to their lord, however you want to frame it. Um, so I think I agree with Dr. Faria, like dismantling what some of these terms actually mean and creating it more in a neutral connotation and mindset. And for us to go back into like what our intentions are behind speaking like this and trying to educate other people. So I feel like it's probably just because we're in the West and because of media that we associate religiosity with extremism, and then that in itself gets connected to terrorism, and then it just kind of spirals from there. So I think having more discussions around that and not being afraid of having discussions around that is probably how we're going to start taking a positive step forward to undo a lot of that damage.
That's actually a really great point. And one thing that I did want to bring up to our audience, because I know we have a multitude of Muslim listeners as well as non Muslim listeners, Islam means peace. So if someone says this person is a Muslim terrorist, you're essentially saying that's a peaceful terrorist. That's an
Mhm.
oxymoron. That's not a thing. And so if people understood what what Islam was in terms of the definition, the ideology, the lifestyle, the teachings, the morals, and the values, they would understand that it is the exact opposite of terrorism. So if anyone is committing terrorism in any capacity, they are thusly not, they may be a Muslim in terms of, they took the Shahada, they practice it to whatever capacity they can. But that specific action of terrorism does not align with the religion. So it's not a reflection of the religion. It's actually quite the opposite of it. And I think to sit down and have these conversations, which can be, really tough with people who are indoctrinated, I think is the most important thing. So we need to open the lines of communication, and we need to first and foremost learn Islam for what it is, not through the Pakistani lens or a cultural lens or the Western lens or the lens of what is being taught to us through, MSM, which would be like Fox or, CNN or MSNBC. We should learn our religion for ourselves as free thinking, rational human beings, understand what it is. And, just like Dr. Furia was saying, it encompasses so much. So we have, Islamic finance, we have Sharia law, which is like the legalities within our religion. We have ways that, women should be treated, how you should treat children, how many times a day you should pray. I mean, it goes on and on. It even encompasses hygiene. And so when you learn the religion as like a rational, like free thinking human being, and then you go out into the world and you see people, practicing it through a cultural lens, or you see people that are, maybe a little westernized and are copying and pasting templates that they're getting through the media. You can sit there and separate what our religion is versus what is, the indoctrination is per se. And that actually brings me into my next topic. When it comes to these terms, extremism and terrorism, how do we start deconstructing that?
Yeah. Um, I'd love to take that question first. Something that I want to preface this by is the beauty of Islam, and something that Allah has taught us over and over again is what's so special about humans is we have free will and we can think for ourselves. And even when the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when he was given the Quran, like he was not sitting there telling people what these ayahs and surahs mean, because we are supposed to take that Quran for ourselves and be able to think. And over again in the Quran, you'll see lines that say, "This is for those who think. This is for those who reflect." Essentially, what Allah is saying is He wants us to think. He wants us to question things. Humans are made to question things. And one of my favorite things about Islam is that it encourages questions. It encourages being, curious about religion. Why was man made? Why are we here? Whereas in a lot of other religions, questions are shunned, and they say, "Oh, you should just believe." That's the magic of religion. But essentially, that's not what Islam is about. So one of the things that really makes me reflect is that we have been given religion, but a lot of people, um, like I mentioned before, they're just practicing it and they're not essentially learning it and really understanding what it means to be a Muslim, or why certain rules and things have been sent down. And so they can't really make their identity strong as a Muslim, and they can't question things. So, like Hina, you mentioned Sharia law. Um, I know so many Muslims where I could bring up Sharia law, and it probably makes them very, very nervous, because this is part of the indoctrination, right? A lot of people, Sharia law has become like this buzzword. Everyone is afraid of it, but what is Sharia law? Like, how many people have actually sat down and understood it? Because there are so many beautiful things on there, so many ways that women have been given so many more rights before the West even thought about giving women rights. It talks about inheritance, it talks about finances. How can we, as a society and community, take care of those who have less money than us? um, And so when we're deconstructing these words that have such negative connotations because of the West, such as extremism, radical Islam, terrorism, Sharia law, we have to, in order to understand how to deconstruct it, we have to discuss the ripple effect of these terms. So, like I mentioned before, and I feel like a lot of us have touched on this topic, to be honest, a lot of Muslims are afraid to practice Islam essentially because they don't understand it to a deeper level, and they have this indoctrination of what happens if you do become a very practicing Muslim. And what has happened because of this is that Muslims have been stripped of the freedom to practice Islam. So the idea of extremism, right, is someone who took the religion too far, and they're using it to hurt other people. But we're having an opposite effect that I've noticed in the West. Instead of that, the foundational covenants of Islam have been labeled as oppressive and extremist, and people are not able to practice them freely. So, for example, like a hijab, the head covering that a lot of Muslim women wear, speaking Arabic or saying Bismillah, starting anything in the name of God out loud, praying in public. These are all fear mongering things for people in the West. And a lot of Muslims won't even practice these openly because they're afraid that this has been labeled as extremism. We can't even bring up Sharia law without being afraid that people will be able to look at us weird or think we're talking about some kind of terrorism. And I think it's so important to talk about the effect of what has happened because of this, because, America is essentially supposed to be a secular country where a lot of people who came here, it was because they were getting persecuted because of practicing religion. And in the West, as Muslims, we are having a lot of trouble doing even the foundational covenants, like myself included. There's a lot of things in Islam that I'm working on, and covering my head is one of them. But I do have a fear because a lot of people will look at you as being an extremist, as, being someone who isn't safe, and it's just a piece of cloth. And so I think we need to really have more discussions on what's happening. And those discussions will start to deconstruct it and separate Islam from extremism, because a lot of the foundational things are not necessarily terrorism.
Beautiful answer. Dr. Hira, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, just to, I guess, summarize and put it simply, it's truly just educating and have not being afraid to have discussions. And I think also humility and being able to say, I don't know all the answers, but I'm going to figure it out and we can have more conversation about this. I think a lot of people are afraid to have conversation, exactly like how Dr. Faria said, because of just a lack of understanding. I was even thinking like the term jihad, people freak out over, and it's just because they don't know what it means. Um, but yeah, I think I've had conversations with a lot of my non-Muslim like people who I've had in my life, and I think that's also important is to be surrounded by people who you can spread dawah to. Obviously, you need Muslim people to help you grow, but you need to have other people in your life and be okay with having conversations with other people in your life who aren't Muslim or aren't as practicing. So that way you can show them the beauty of Islam and show that we do have free will and we choose to do a lot of these things for ourselves. Just a quick anecdote. I will always remember in college, I had a professor, PhD, doctorate, like very, very intelligent, and I'm forgetting what, some type of biology. And he grew up in a Greek Orthodox household. So he grew up, it was forced on him. And then he grew up and hated any institution. He hated religion. He hated marriage, was divorced, adopted his own daughter. Like he was just like, I will do whatever I want because I'm free from all this. And I told him one day, I think I'm going to start a headscarf. I think I'm going to start hijab one day. Like I feel very strongly about it. And he had the most like visceral negative reaction. And this is like a middle-aged man, white man. And he had such a visceral reaction to it. He was like, how could you do this? This is so unlike you. This is like oppressive. And I don't think you should do it. And he felt so strongly about it. And it was so interesting because I don't think people outright tell you their reaction of what they think of things like hijab or things that are very representative of Islam. And I had to tell him, I'm like, you telling me not to wear something is the exact same as somebody telling me to wear something. I was like, "This is my
Mhm.
own choice. I decided I wanted to do this. I don't have parents who have forced this on me. Nobody told me I had to do it. I came here of my own accord to tell you that this is how I feel, and you're telling me what to do." And it shut him up. He stopped talking. He was just like, "Okay, fine. If this was your choice, then fine. I understand. I understand." But it's having that, and I've had multiple people have a visceral reaction to me telling them, "I think I'm gonna start a headscarf," because they associate it with very negative people. So I think deconstruction does have to start with having conversations with people who are unfamiliar with what it means to be a religious Muslim, not even just a Muslim, and then start undoing these thought processes of what extremism looks like.
That's actually a really, really good point. And one thing that I did want to, point out is in the Western world, there's a lot of people like women's activists who will say, well, in Iran and various different countries, they are forced to wear the hijab, and that's not okay. And I agree with that. If the government is forcing women to do something against their will, it's not okay. But it's not the hijab that's oppressive, it is the lack of choice. And in the US, if people are going to sit there and say, oh, well, you shouldn't wear the hijab because it's oppressive, and they're taking away that choice, in my opinion, there's honestly no difference between the ignorance of the West and the ignorance in countries like that. If you are basically saying that, wearing a hijab or not a hijab is not something that you can do out of your own free will, I'm going to decide that as the government, as your family, as, your colleague. It's opposite ends of the exact same spectrum. So I think if people want to sit there and criticize governments that are forcing women to wear something or do something, they should also allow women within the context of their own countries to wear the scarf or not wear the scarf. Because if Americans came out and said, hey, you're not allowed to wear a hijab, it's now illegal, kind of like how we saw in France, we saw the hijab ban come about. To me, there's no difference between France doing that and then Iran forcing it, because it's essentially taking away the choice. If a woman wants to be modest with a piece of cloth, whether it's for religious purposes or not, that is out of her own free will. And that's a choice that should be respected and exercised, especially within the Western world, when they go on and on about all the freedoms and the secularism and how, religious freedom is like such a huge facet of the West. By taking away this option, I think it really impedes on what the West claims to be. And I think that sort of hypocrisy is something that we need to openly discuss with people. Choice is choice. If women say, hey, we don't want to be modest, we want to engage in, I don't know, like sex work or dress a certain way or be scantily clad or, whatever the case may be, if that is a freedom that is respected and given to women, then women should be allowed to say, hey, I don't want to be treated a certain way. I want to dress a certain way. I want to be modest. I want to be covered. I want to be known for my intellect and attributes that are not sexualized per se. They have every right to do that as well. It's about choice and it's about freedom, but it goes to both ends of the spectrum. So thank you so much for your insight. I'm always growing with all the people that I interview. I feel like whenever I bring people on, I really like to learn. And I think the more questions that I ask, the more I'm like, okay, what are the answers that I'm going to get out of this? And it literally makes me sit down and think after the interviews, like, there's so much more out there that I myself need to learn. And I just wanted to pause for a moment. For any latecomers to the show, you are watching the Muslim Street. You can follow us on X. You can follow us on Facebook. You can also follow us on YouTube. Right now we are discussing Islamophobia in the West and how to, like talk about Islamophobic terminology within the context of the Ummah and basically rescind it. I have Dr. Furia as well as Dr. Hira. We're just kind of going over some questions. But the question I had, was, what does Islam say about using violence? And this is actually not my strong suit. So, Dr. Hira, Dr. Furia, please go ahead.
Mhm. Yeah, I'd love to take that first. I want to preface this by discussing why religion is even used in connection to violence. And the honest truth is, for centuries and centuries, leaders have abused religion and used it as a tool to gain control, influence, followers, and to justify their actions. And even right now, with the political climate we have right now, we can see it being done again right in front of our eyes. And a lot of times, their political actions and ideologies do not necessarily match the religions that they claim to practice. They use religion to sometimes give them some kind of divine legitimacy for their actions. And it's also a very good way to feed on the ethos of people and instantly gain a following because they're feeding on something that's really personal and dear to a lot of people. So when someone is coming out and using it as their tool and claiming it as their identity, it's very easy to get people to be followers. And so I think the first thing is that we should know that this has been a tool that has been used in the past by many, many leaders. We saw it with Constantine the Great. We saw it with the Spanish Inquisition. We saw it with the Crusades. I mean, I could sit here and name it so many instances where it has been used and abused. But for some reason, I think Islam happens to be the religion that has gotten the short end of the stick. For some reason, for Islam, it is just being tied together rather than being able to separate out these, abusive leaders versus the religion. And I think, Hina, even you mentioned it before, like Iran, a lot of the things that they're doing invalidate the teachings of Islam. You can't force anyone to practice religion. You can't force anyone to do anything. And if someone even does something or a covenant of Islam, but it is not true and dear to their heart, that actually Islam teaches us a lot of times you don't get a lot of that barakah or those blessings for it because the whole point of Islam is free will, is that you choose to do something, you've decided to do it, you agree with it, and you understand why you're doing it. So, taking that all in mind, now jumping into what Islam says about violence, and this is a really big topic, and we could sit here and I could really quote a lot of surahs that discuss it, but I want to give the context. Islam is one of the religions that gives no blanket authorization to hurt people. And a lot of the texts are taken out of context. So, for instance, in Surah 60 of the Quran, it talks a lot about the rules of engaging in war. And I feel like a lot of people don't understand the rules of war etiquette in Islam. So, for instance, a lot of Muslims, when these surahs were sent down about war, they were facing religious persecution. A lot of the pagans were attacking them and hurting them, and they weren't fighting back until these surahs came down. And it was kind of like a last resort and self defense. And so, what Islam says about this is that as Muslims, we never are supposed to initiate a war or hurting anyone else. In fact, Islam says that if you hurt one innocent person, it's as if you have killed all of humanity because it values life and it's given it so much importance and how sacred a life is. Even every single life is sacred. And so Islam's rulings say that you should only use it as self defense. And if someone wants peace, then that's what you should do. You should give them peace. And if it has to go to war, then you don't go or transgress past anything. So you don't hurt the women, you don't hurt the children, you don't hurt the animals, you don't hurt the land. If they ask for peace, then you give for it. If you have prisoners, then you don't hurt them more than absolutely necessary. And a lot of it talks about intention as well. So if someone, says if you're in war and they've attacked you first and you're, acting in self-defense, if someone asks for peace, it's not up to you on to your ability to read their heart and their intentions on if they actually want peace. If they ask for peace, then you give that peace to them. And as you're going through like the text and really understanding this and the context when it comes down, you understand that fighting is essentially a very, very, very last resort in Islam. And using violence to control people and get them to practice your religion kind of invalidates the religion altogether. So I think it's so important to understand that, why does Islam mean peace? Why do you, how can a religion mean peace if it's encouraging violence, and the truth is it doesn't. A lot of these things have been taken and used and twisted to be able to justify their own political agendas.
Dr. Hira?
I mean, I feel like Dr. Faria kind of said it all, but I think the biggest thing is I think what's difficult is having to be just like regular people in our day to day trying to dismantle this entire just political game that's existing in the entire world, like within the Middle East, with Saudi, with with the West, with just there's just intentions that are just so self-centered around all of these countries, around all of these leaders. And honestly, one of the big things on the day of judgment is like these leaders are going to have to answer for how they led. And I don't know if even these leaders know Islam because it doesn't appear to be. So I think what is really, really hard, and I think what is really important with this conversation is how to expand this for layman's people to understand that there's problems in the higher levels here with leadership and that it's not true Islam and how we can start dismantling that from like where our level is. Um, and that's where I think hopefully all this idea about Islam being associated with violence can start to disintegrate a little bit more. But yeah, I mean like it's the same thing, having more conversation, becoming more educated, going straight to the book and realizing what guidelines are actually in there because it's all there. Like Allah has written the blueprint on how to be a successful leader, how to be a successful Muslim, and how to probably navigate some of these hard conversations as well.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think we also have to remember that the geopolitical world or the world of economics and all these different factions, if you will, within civilization, these are man made systems. So if there are various different countries or factions or governments that are hurting people, and, the majority of the people who, practice the faith are Muslim, it doesn't mean that they are doing or like these are Muslim things intrinsically. These are human actions that are being committed by Muslims who are not, practicing the religion the way that it should be. We also have to understand that if you go into geopolitics as a whole, the way that certain resistance groups per se, and I'm not saying, oh, I'm for them or against them. This is just an example. If resistance groups act a certain way, or if terrorists act a certain way, or governments act a certain way, that's not a reflection on the people either. I think sometimes we look at the actions of a few and say, okay, the entire country must function like that. Oh, look, there's a couple of Pakistanis who did X, Y, and Z. Maybe all of Pakistan is like that. Or look, there's a couple of Muslims who are engaging in very negative things, and thus all Muslims are like that. And I don't think that's fair. I don't think we should take the actions of a few and let it, basically pollute the entire religion or the entire, ethnicity or nationality. And so people also have to understand that even though that's the way it should be, that's theoretical at best. And so as Muslims, we must always be ambassadors of our faith. So if we want to change the narrative of how Muslims are being viewed per se, I think by us engaging in nonviolence, by being kind, by being compassionate, by not gossiping, by not creating drama, by not, engaging in things that are harmful for like the community at large and essentially being good Samaritans, I think that in itself is, a way to deconstruct these terms, because I think people need to, look at the difference between what they're hearing on, Fox News, for example, versus being surrounded by a multitude of Muslims where they can say, oh my gosh, like these people are so kind, they're so compassionate. I feel inspired. I actually want to open up a Quran and learn more about it. Like, where do these people get this level of like faith? And I think, leading by example is sometimes one of the best things. Sometimes I think it's even more powerful than the conversations itself, because conversations are words, but the way that we function, they're essentially actions. But, I did want to get into the next question, which was, when do you think Islam started being associated with terms like terrorism and extremism in the context of the West?
Yeah. So it's interesting because there are quite a few different terms that have been used in the past and present to try to tie this, this big thing between Islam and terrorism. So in the 1979 is actually the first time the term radical Islam was ever used was actually in an article published by the New York Jewish Weekly. And it had used this term to describe some of, the political actions of Iran's leader at that time. And this term really caught fire. And then after that, we continued to see it used. And I think it really took off in 1984 during like a vice president debate when George Bush used radical Islam, and he said radical Islam is a threat to American interests. So instantly we have this negative connotation. Then, as we started moving into the 20th century, we saw a new word kind of enter into the chat, and that was extremism. So I think it's so important to talk about where these words came from, and a lot of these came from the media. So in the 20th century, a lot of the media and that public discourse around Muslims became calling them all extremists if there are groups that, are hurting other people. And at this point, I think it's really important to note that America was actively spending a lot of tax money, resources, and sending troops to the Middle East. And this is a huge topic that we can really dive into. There are a lot of conflicts of interest, keeping power and imperialism over the Middle East, a lot of the resources, destabilizing countries. I mean, it's a huge topic. And when you are spending tax dollars and sending people's children to war in countries where they may never come back, one of the biggest thing you need is public support. And the best way to win support from people is fear. And that is exactly what the media did. Fear of Islam, fear of Sharia law. We need to send our troops there. We need to spend our money and our resources because of radical Islam and extremist Islam. And there's always this big narrative that, oh, the Muslims are trying to bring Sharia law here. The Muslims are bringing extremism here. But, the truth is that a lot of these groups that they're discussing of being, extremist Muslims, they are actually hurting more Muslims than they're hurting non-Muslims. So it begs the question, if these people claim the identity of being Muslims, first of all, every single action that they're doing invalidates being Muslim. Just because someone claims to be a Muslim, but if they're not practicing it correctly, can they truly be called a Muslim? And second, if they are claiming to be Muslims, why are they hurting and killing and bombing more Muslims than anything else? How can those two really coexist? But it also goes back to the fact that a lot of that is not discussed in the media. A lot of people, Muslims included, don't know the politics behind it. They don't know that a lot of these, terrorist organizations are bombing a lot of Muslims and different factions of Islam as well. And because of that, now that has been the term that we use. Actually, like in 2016, Obama tried to free himself from using radical Islam and tried to say, he discussed how he has had lots of conversations with Muslims, and radical Islam is not an appropriate term because it's biased and it spreads Islamophobia. And because of that, he actually became under attack for using that. He was labeled as, empathetic to the terrorists, empathetic to the Muslims, where all he was doing was his due diligence and being able to, tie that association that shouldn't belong there in the first place. And what's really interesting is that a lot of Muslims actually never sit back and question themselves on, why am I using this term and is this damaging to Muslims? Because this is all they've been taught, and myself included. Until I really started diving into religion and understanding how language impacts me. When I really started, learning about Islam, I'm not going to lie, I had a moment where I just sat and I cried and I was like, I cannot believe that I believed all of these things. I can't believe that I've been using these damaging words. Like anytime someone would ask me about, the terrorists, I would say, oh no, those are the bad Muslims. We're the good Muslims. But why are they even considered Muslims if they're not practicing like Muslims and they're hurting Muslims? Why do they get to claim it and damage the reputation of all Muslims? Whereas a lot of times when other people or other religions have terrorists that use religion as their reason for their terrorism, that connotation and that connection is not quite as strong. But for Muslims, because it fits a lot of the political agenda of the West, and a lot of the fear mongering to kind of contain the influence of Islam, I think it's a narrative that works. And so it's really important to step back and understand, where did these terms come from? Do they really fit? And why are we using them? And we can't expect non-Muslims to understand and question problematic terms if Muslims a lot of times aren't able to question if this is an appropriate term to use.
Thank you, Dr. Faria. Dr. Hira, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think kind of bouncing off with what Dr. Frio was talking about in terms of like, well, why did it become Islam that people target? And I think it's just people, like, it's just human nature that everyone just needs someone to blame. Somebody that people just need something to hate and to blame to make sense of their own world, if that makes sense. And I think what's easy about Islam is that people have taken things out of context. The media has blown it out of proportion. It's clearly been happening for decades at this point. And other Muslims, unfortunately, just as Dr. Faria was saying, was they are not helping the religion by dismantling some of these things and clarifying what some of these things are happening, because a lot of people don't know the origins of why this is happening. But it just makes it easy to blame. Like, we are just an easy target, and we're not making it easier on ourselves. And I think that's what's really hard is it takes one person to start that progress of having these discussions, but it takes us as a collective to want to do it. And I think a part of what's difficult is we are not a collective. Unfortunately, like, our Ummah has not been a collective. We have not been united in a lot of things and in a lot of ways. Um, so I think these terms get lost because we're not united enough to actually do something about it.
I absolutely agree with that. And I did want to actually add on a little bit to what both of you said. When you look at the history of colonization and imperialism, anytime that there's a group that has been oppressed or basically bombing countries, sanctioning countries, oppressing people through slavery, indentured servants, colonizing a country, anytime that you've seen the West go in and do that, they've never been like, oh, these Native Americans, they're amazing human beings. We're just terrible people. They'd say, oh, well, they're savages and thus we must do X, Y, and Z. Even, with slavery, what did they say? Oh, well, Africans are inferior to us, X, Y, and Z, and thus this is why they're our slaves. Even when it comes to the Middle East, oh, these Muslims, they're barbaric, they're savages, Islam is so radical. And so basically what I'm trying to say is, throughout the course of oppression, throughout the course of, or the history of oppression and the history of colonization and the history of colonialism in general, you'll essentially see that if groups want to marginalize other groups, they're not going to get public support if they're basically admitting that they're doing oppressing and they're, taking advantage of innocent civilians and populations that don't deserve it. So the way that they basically say, hey, it's justified that we're treating these human beings inhumanely by starving them, killing them, colonizing them, enslaving them, sanctioning them, bombing them, creating proxy wars, and, the list goes on, creating famines. It's because they deserve it. There's something intrinsically wrong with their race. There's something intrinsically wrong with their personalities. There's something intrinsically wrong with their religion. I think that it's no mistake that right around the time that the US started bombing so many different countries in South Asia, so many different countries in the Middle East for geopolitical interests, which is predominantly economic, that was around the time that Islam really came under fire. Right? It's not like they were just saying, oh, Islam is terrible and that's that. I think they had geopolitical interests, which ended up causing them to throw Islam under the bus. And, we've seen it time and time again throughout the course of history. Unfortunately, right now, Islam is the one that's being bullied. So I did, definitely want to bring that up. And I did want to switch gears in terms of my questions, especially because, at the Muslim Street, this is the first time that we have an all-female panel. Super excited about that. I actually wanted to get into what purpose or role do Muslim women play in the context of the West? So what is our role as women in the grand scheme of, you know, everything we're essentially discussing? I know, very heavy question, so please answer it as you may.
I'll take this one first, and it is a very heavy question. And I think what's tough is I think women have to work harder. I just think that's the reality. I think the way that we portray ourselves, whether we decide to wear hijab or we don't decide to wear hijab, and unfortunately, I think wearing hijab is harder because you are a physical representation of Islam. Like that's the first thing people are going to think of is like that's a Muslim woman. And the role I think we have to play is very much who our persona is going to be in the moment that people meet us. So I think the way that our approachability, manners, conversations that we have, and I think a lot of this helps represent what a Muslim should be. And then hopefully that opens the door into comfort with another Muslim person, and that expands into interest into Islam. So, I think that goes back to, like, our conversation before about hijab, and one of my, hesitations, let's say, about starting it is that approachability factor is going to change, and it's my personal test, but I think, I've been hesitant to start it because I don't wanna be less approachable. I find it easy that people can come up to me and feel like they can have a conversation about anything, but the more I'm kind of working through that and I'm realizing, well, maybe I have to work on myself too and my own approachability, or maybe I have to be the person that makes the first move so people know that Muslims are very peaceful people and I have to be a representation of that. So I think our role as women is to teach the beauty of Islam through our manners and work on that kind of step by step.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I would love to give, just a little bit of history. I know I mentioned this a little bit before, but Islam gave women rights far before the West even considered it, before, many countries, it gave women lots of respect. And how do you come to terms with that when the West has taught you that, Muslim women are so oppressed? And in Islam, coming getting to a pure Islamic state is being in true submission and complete submission to Allah, right? To God. So whether we are listening to the rulings of, the commandments by God, or we're consuming what's been taught to us by capitalism. And so, you get to choose which one you want to be a slave to. As Muslims, we call ourselves slaves. Why do we call ourselves slaves, right? I wasn't born I wasn't born wanting to wear mini skirts and being hypersexualized and being used, as a sexual object. I wasn't born wanting to do those things. A lot of these things have been fed into me by the media, by capitalism, because they benefit off of these things, financially. They benefit off of this whole narrative around women that they've created. And a lot of women, myself included, in the past used to think that that was true freedom. Freedom is being able to wear whatever I want, being able to do whatever I want. And the truth is that that makes women not be able to love and respect themselves, because they are focusing on the physical self. And as Muslims, we are supposed to be able to detach from the physical body. This is just my vessel. Whether I was given beauty or not, it has nothing to do with me. I did nothing to earn it, and it is going to do nothing in deciding whether I go to heaven or hell, or if I'm a good person or a bad person. My soul, my ruh, is what decides if I'm a good person or not. And so I have a decision to make as a woman. Am I going to be a slave to capitalism that teaches me to show my body, um, be hypersexualized, show off my beauty? And then with that comes all the effects of it, right? Like not feeling good enough. So many women are getting so much plastic surgery. They're unhappy with themselves. They're bullied. We are literally, distorting our own faces to feed into fabs that change every single generation, and we're dissatisfied. And a lot of women that do it, they still don't find beauty in themselves. And then the less clothes you wear, then you're putting yourselves at risk of being sexualized by men. They're looking at your body. This is really interesting, but there was a study that showed, when men saw women without clothing on, which part of their brain was activated. The less clothes women had on, the part of their brain that was activated was the same one as tools. Why are women being seen as tools to men when they're wearing less clothing? Now, I can choose to be a slave to that, or I can choose to be a slave to God, the perfect God, who teaches me to love myself, that my value is not dependent on the way I look. And a lot of these things, like wearing a scarf, is protecting me from these things essentially, right? Now, am I perfect? No, I'm human. I'm working my way towards these things. I believe in these things. I understand the value in these things, but I was born in the West and I'm dismantling a lot of these things. So I think as women, it's so important for us to teach other women how they're being oppressed in the West, and that Islam actually frees us from these things. Like, we decide what we want to consume in. We decide how we want to be labeled. We decide how we get to be seen. And I think how we discuss, because there's so many layers on top of this. A lot of these Western women, they tie oppression to us because there are countries like Iran that are forcing women to wear scarves when they don't want to wear scarves. And it's back to that notion. You cannot force anyone in Islam to do anything because that's not genuinely what they want to do. It invalidates all of those teachings. And, by having these discussions, discussing these things, we can open women's minds more to understanding what it means to be a female. Like, I have never felt so free and powerful and respected as a woman as I have done as, a Muslim woman. Even to bring it back to like something small, right? Like, as Muslims, men can marry women who are from other Abrahamic faiths, but women cannot. You might think that's misogynistic. But once you dive in more, you understand that as a woman, I have rights that I expect from a Muslim man, and I cannot get those from another man who doesn't practice Islam. I cannot guarantee myself that. But if a Muslim man marries a woman who's not Muslim, he still has to uphold all those values to that woman. He still has to give all those things to her. And so, it's understanding your rights in Islam, understanding what these things mean, and having those discussions to dismantle this idea that women are oppressed. Because truly in Islam, I would rather be a slave to a perfect God who protects me from a lot of, the terrible things that happen when I don't listen.
No, that was a beautiful answer. And, one thing that I wanted to remind all women is we are life force. So I know in the context of Western feminism, which I, subscribed to when I was much younger, you're taught that men and women should be equal. And so women should be able to do all the things that men do. And I think once I started researching and learning about Islam, I realized, wait, women and men are not equal. There's distinctive gender roles, and that's because women and men serve very different purposes. There's some things that men can do that women can never. But one thing that Western feminism didn't teach women is that there's intrinsic things that women can do that men could never do. And to be candid, in Islam, women are not equal to men. We are actually put on a pedestal. At the end of the day, you look at, certain expressions or sayings or surahs like, heaven or Jannah lies at the feet of mother. It's not father, it's mother. And even when it comes to surahs itself, there's an entire surah dedicated to women. Men don't have that, but women do. And, there's even a saying, and I hope I don't butcher it, so please correct me if I do. But the prophet even said, the best of you are those who are good to their wives. And so that was a huge reflection of how women were perceived in the context of Islam. And we have to remember that Islam views women, I don't want to say superior, but it definitely puts us on a pedestal because we have life source. We are life source. We are, we're able to have children. We're able to carry on the entire genetics, right? The entire bloodline of a man. And we're honored for that. This is not considered something negative. It's something that's considered a privilege. And Islam really honors that. And so if you really study Islam for what it is, you'll understand that the West has a lot of catching up to do. And if you practice Islam and you are a woman, understand that it comes with privileges. It comes with beauty. And modesty is part of that beauty because you're no longer viewed viewed as a tool or as an object, as Dr. Furia said. You're viewed as this beautiful human being that is life source. So, I did want to get into the next question. How can we be ambassadors of our faith, whether it's a man or a woman, especially in the context of the West?
I can take this one. I feel like being a strong ambassador of faith is feeling confident in who you are in it, even if you don't feel like you're the most knowledgeable, or if you feel that you're still learning. It's having that humility to be like, hey, I identify myself as a Muslim. This is what I'm learning. This is what I want to share. And I want to share it with whoever's interested around me. Um, and I think also, kind of in the same vein of being a female and what that means in the context of Islam as well. So I think as we go through our own personal journeys of Islam, I think it's okay to share that with other people and to share what it means to you and to educate other people in what your journey is, because none of us are perfect. And I think none of us are thinking that we have to be. I'm hoping people are not don't have to sorry. I'm hoping people don't feel they have to be perfect to be able to share with their identity as a Muslim. I know even for me, like sharing my struggles with my non-Muslim colleagues or friends or whoever it is, they would find it so interesting. Like, oh, that I'm struggling with the headscarf. Oh, when you guys go out to drink, I feel like I don't want to come and it socially isolates me sometimes. Things like that, having conversations around what our boundaries are as Muslims, and then sharing that with other people to help them have a lens into who we are, and then realizing that it's actually very human and not something terribly extreme. I think that's how we can be strong ambassadors moving forward. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that answer. I think that's beautiful. And something that I want to say is that sometimes we often forget that even though we were born and our parents, told us that we're Muslim, we have to find Islam for ourselves. Every single Muslim has to find Islam. I feel like a lot of times we take that for granted. And like I mentioned before, we just accept the rudimentary level of Islam, and we have a due diligence on ourselves to learn more. We were given a very beautiful thing. We were given a brain. We have so many resources at our fingertips. There is no excuse for us to really dive in and have those, complex questions. If you are having difficulty coming to terms with something about Islam, dive in. Find the resources, be able to answer those questions. If you need assistance in trying to grapple with, something that Islam says, then find someone who can help you find those answers, because we were meant to do that. And I don't think that we can be ambassadors of our faith until we're able to grapple with those by ourselves. And bringing it back to what Dr. Hira said is we don't have to be perfect. We are Muslim. If I had to explain the qualities of a Muslim to like I'm sorry, not a Muslim, a human to an alien, perfect is not a term I would use. Because we're not perfect, And so it's okay to not know everything. It's okay to not be a perfect Muslim, but it is not okay to not have the answers and not do anything about it. And I think that's the first step. And I think the second step of it is regardless of what position you are in, whether you have a position of power, whether this is public discourse or whether this is private, please, please, please have those uncomfortable conversations and come from a place of love. That's what Islam teaches us, is use kindness. If someone is using a term that's problematic, come to them with love and talk about why those terms are not acceptable, what that does for Muslims, how it's damaging to them, correct them, teach them a new way to use it, whether it's Muslims or non-Muslims. Don't take for granted the power that you have. Like, just because you're only impacting one person doesn't mean that it's not going to have a huge impact, because that person is going to talk to other people and it's going to continue and continue and continue. So I think the message that I would say is, this is my call to action. Doesn't matter who you are, what position you are, please have that power to have these uncomfortable conversations. And please, 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 if you have questions about Islam, dive in. I promise you, you will find the answers. It might take a little bit of time, but I promise you the answers are there. That's the beauty of Islam.
Thank you so much, Dr. Furia and Dr. Hira. We are kind of coming to an end. I wish we could, talk about so many more things. Inshallah, I can have both of you back on. I know plenty of people are going to have questions and want to reach out to you. Dr. Furia, Dr. Hira, would you like to share your email address, social media, ways to contact you?
Yeah, absolutely. You guys can email me any questions you have or any collaborations I love to hear. My email address is fchaudhry1992
And mine is hjafri0786
Thank you so much. And I did also want to note that the Muslim Street does have a periodical. Anyone is able to submit to it. So if you are an author, a journalist, you have any ideas, you're going through censorship with other publications, please reach out to me. Please reach out to Malik Aziz. We would love to look at your work and publish it under the Muslim Street. We are Muslim journalism for Muslims by Muslims without having to censor ourselves, especially combating MSM like we've kind of gone over in this episode. But that being said, I'm Hina Lotus. This is the Muslim Street. Thank you so much for tuning in. Please make sure to follow us on X, on Facebook, and YouTube. And inshallah, I'd love to have both you, Dr. Furia and Dr. Hira on very, very soon. Thank you so much. I'm humbled.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
Have a good night, everyone.